One of my favorite things to do in the whole world is hiking. And you know why? It's because the views are epic. Nature is so friggin' beautiful and fascinating. It's full of these cool looking plants and weird little animals and breathtaking landscapes and all the colors of the rainbow. It's all just stunning. And you know what else is beautiful? Us. Yeah, you, me, and everybody. And you know why? It's because we're not all clones. Can you imagine how weird that would be? Imagine living in a world where everybody looks exactly like you and then trying to date. It would be like dating a mirror image of you. I guess personality would count for a lot, but it would still be kind of creepy. I feel like someone needs to turn this into a movie, but I digress. What I'm getting at is that diversity and beauty are interwoven, and through diversity, you don't just get more variety, you also get more beauty. I'll just say that today in this video, we're going to explore the beauty of diversity together. Welcome back to the second season of Loom-In-ESSENCE, the series where I share my artistic adventures building experimental bead looms, and we talk a little bit about art and a lot about life. I am your host and artist, Shine. Today I'll be sharing one of my recent works with you titled Journey Through the Scene and the Unseeable. This season I'm conducting a bunch of experiments to help prepare me to create my first large-scale piece, so we'll start off by talking about the experiments that I conducted on this piece, and then I'll get into the symbolism behind the design and the inspiration for the piece. And if you missed the previous video, here's the link for it, and I'll also leave it in the description for you. Let's dive into the experiments. For this piece, I continued working with hooks, and I decided to use up the hooks from a couple episodes ago when I went on that really time-consuming side quest of trying to paint the hooks to better match the color of the wood, which was entirely unnecessary. But I had a bunch of hooks left over, and I decided I would use them for this piece. And I went with the original placement, meaning I had the hooks visible, creating a band that ran along the perimeter of the frame. And I decided to do this because I figured if I put in so much energy into painting the hooks, I wanted to showcase them. And I also thought it looked kind of cool. It looks a bit like teeth. For the most part, I went back to using hooks only and no eyes for this piece, in contrast to what I did with the last piece where I alternated them. However, I did experiment at one end of alternating the hooks with the eyes to make the hooks fit better on the tight curve. And I also experimented with doing just hooks on one end and only eyes on the other end to create a zipper-like effect at the other end of the frame where it was very narrow due to the two ends of the branches being joined together. I also experimented with attaching the warp threads on an angle. So when I started working on this piece, I wasn't really sure where I wanted to go with it, and I decided to take a playful and experimental approach. Once the hooks were attached to the frame, I started attaching the warp threads to every other hook, and I observed that the warp threads were creating this really beautiful pattern as the threads slightly shifted, which gave me the idea to attach the warp threads on an angle and create an intentional pattern, which you can see here. This ended up being a tension experiment on a larger scale, and it gave me the chance to explore what happens to the tension when large portions of the loom are left not only without being beaded upon, but also without warp threads at all. I was curious to see if the zigzagging pattern of the warp threads would cause the hooks to bunch up or ripple, but much to my surprise, this didn't happen. However, this time, due to the size and shape of the piece, I did run into the issue of the warp threads unhooking while I was adjusting the tension. With experimentation, I found that if I adjusted the warp threads from the back, so basically flipping the frame over so that the hooks are facing away, it was easier to adjust the tension this way because the warp threads were less likely to slip off. And I also found that it was useful to adjust the tension of the widest part of the piece first, and then the narrow part. So in this case, it would mean starting out in the middle and then doing the two ends. I also let myself have a little extra fun while creating this piece. I deconstructed my process a little bit, and I continued working in sections in a playful way where I built the frame and I attached the warp threads, but then instead of attaching beads to the warp threads, I decided to put together another makeshift loom, which was basically a basket and barbecue skewers. And then I used that to create the beaded portion for this piece. And then once I finished that, I attached it to this frame. Which, I don't know, like sometimes I just need to do things in a weird way because it is more stimulating for my brain. And that's what happened here. I guess you could say I kind of went off book with this one, letting myself do things in a different way. This piece is definitely noticeably different from the rest, and that's intentional. Like so much of my work, the inspiration for this piece also came from my time in nature and observing nature's creativity and variety and definitely the colors. So one of the cool things about color in nature is that each place has its own palette. So depending on what grows there and what elements and minerals you'll find in the ground, you get different colors. So for example, when you have higher levels of iron oxide, you'll get reds, oranges, sometimes even like orangey yellows. And when you have manganese, you'll get purples, like sometimes even blues in the rocks, which is just so beautiful. It always strikes me how effortlessly beautiful nature is. It's quite easy and natural to appreciate the beauty of the diversity of the plants, the animals, and the land itself. Its beauty is obvious, undeniable, and diversity is part of what makes it so. And that diversity also shows up in us, humans. Unfortunately, diversity in people tends to be met with a very different response, often interpreted as something threatening instead of something beautiful, which is truly a bummer. And there are so many ways that we are diverse. Some of the ways are more obvious, like height or build or race. And then there are other ways that are more subtle, like preferences, abilities, aptitude. And one of the things that I've been pondering while I've been spending all this time outdoors in nature is the relationship between the more subtle differences and the more noticeable ones. And so that brings us to the journey through the seen and the unseeable, which FYI is the title of this piece in case you missed that. This concept is embodied in this piece. At a quick glance, the part that stands out the most is the beaded part, and it looks as if that part holds the frame together. But this is an illusion. So the beaded part rests on the frame, but it's not the source of its structure. If you look closer at the piece, you'll notice these almost invisible warp threads inside the frame. And it's these subtle threads that create the tension that then determines the shape of the piece and hold the branches in position. That's how I feel about being neurodivergent. It's the part of me that people often can't see, but has so profoundly shaped how I experience life, how I relate to myself, the environment, and others, which has then given way to more obvious and noticeable differences. Even things like being queer and gender non-conforming, for me, feel deeply connected to my autistic experience of life, and apparently I'm not alone. So research now tells us that there is a statistically significant correlation between autism and gender diversity, which definitely explains why over the years more and more of my queer friends, which is almost all my friends, have gotten diagnosed as being neurodivergent, which is kind of nice because I like the company. And so as much as the wide variety of colors in this piece are an embodiment of the diversity found in nature, they are also a nod to neurodiversity and gender diversity found in humanity, both of which are associated with the symbol of the visible spectrum of colors, more commonly referred to as the rainbow. You'll also notice the difference in the movement of color at one end of the beaded section versus the other. So at one end, the colors are consistent and orderly, and at the other end, they are a cocktail of unpredictability. And if you're wondering if that has anything to do with anything, well, let me tell you. Imagine this. You have a project, you have a deadline, you have a plan. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? Wrong. Now imagine you're me and you have ADHD. And what happens? None other than another side quest. So it was a beautiful day, and I was outside. And what do I find? None other than this magnificent piece of wood. And as soon as I saw it, I just fell in love. I was like, I have to work with this piece of wood. It's so beautiful. Now hold that thought. Remember the part about having a project, a deadline, and a plan? Well, as a result, I didn't have time to work with this branch because the plan was to do some smaller experiments on smaller pieces and then move on to a larger piece. And this branch was neither small enough nor large enough to fit into that plan. So clearly the answer was to put it aside and move on, right? Absolutely not. That is not how ADHD works. And who am I kidding? There's just something about biting off more than you can chew, especially when it's unreasonable, that is particularly appealing to the ADHD brain. So here we are, once again, complicating our way through life, and you would think that would be the end of it, right? You wish. And honestly, so do I. I wish it were that simple to just modify the plan and then move forward. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with autism, but that is not how that works either. So yes, on one hand, I was really excited to follow my creative impulse. But at the same time, I was deeply disturbed by the idea of having to deviate from the plan, and I genuinely struggled to adjust to the change, even though I myself was the source of it. And you would think that's not possible, and yet here we are. Welcome to the struggle that is my brain. And so, what better way to move forward than with a beaded representation of these two seemingly opposed tendencies? With at one end the colors flowing in long, organized sections which are slow to change. Hello, autism, that would be you. And at the other end, them changing rapidly and creating a confetti of chaos. Hello, ADHD, glad you could make it. Now in this piece, I was able to bridge the two. But in the rest of my life, I am still working on it. I'd argue that diversity is woven into the very fabric of our existence, and its expression through us is a reflection of nature's endless creativity, resilience, and adaptability. But that doesn't always make it easy to deal with, especially in a world that's not designed to include and accommodate all of human diversity. But maybe that's where you and I come in. Now, I don't know if you're neurodivergent too, or what your story is, but I do know we all have our differences. And most of us have grown up in societies that have not valued or welcomed these. And I don't know how to change that, but here's what I have figured out. Embarking on a journey of self-compassion and acceptance of my own neurodivergence has helped me to become more compassionate and accepting of others' differences. And by learning how to improve the quality of my life by asking for and accepting the accommodations that I need, I've become a better advocate, not just for myself, but also for others in my community. And so, although I may not have changed the world at large, I am learning how to change how I show up in it. And I hope you'll join me on this journey. Well, that's it for today, folks. But before I go, I'd like to acknowledge the support of the Canada Council for the Arts for making this project possible. And thank you, the viewers, for watching. See you next time.